So in this section, we're going to learn about the method call stack. And so I want you to understand how C# performs method calls. And we need to consider this idea of the method call stack so that we understand when we are using these methods, what is the implication? What is happening in the system? And we have this collection of related data items, this data structure that is known as a stack. And a stack is essentially the idea that I have a platform here, let's just call it like a plate, right? And we're going to stack a bunch of things on top of this. And so as I add each item to the stack, one sits right on top of the other. Now, if I want to access an item in that stack, I have to start at the top. I can't access items below without first going through the items at the top. So some people like to think of a pile of dishes, right? So when a dish is placed on the pile, it's placed on the top. And if we want to pull a dish from the middle, we can't do that. It would just completely crash all of our dishes and make a huge mess. So we have to always remove items from the stack off the top before we would be able to access anything below it. So we have this idea in the compiler called the method call stack. And it's a data structure that works behind the scenes to support our method calls and returns mechanism. So it supports the creation, the maintenance, and the destruction of each method as we create it and as it goes through the system. So as we work in our program, we can think of this idea. So as I call a method, right, it gets added to the stack. So maybe I have a method, and we're going to look at an example of this, but I have a method called square. And so I would add that to the stack. And maybe inside of square, I call another method from the math class. Now, at the very bottom down here, this is where I started execution. So maybe this was a main method, maybe this was another method, but when the compiler is done here in the math section, we take it off the stack and remove it, and then we get down to square, and then we take it off the stack and remove it so that we can get back to this point of execution. So let's take a look at an example in the code and where we can view our method call stack in Visual Studio. Okay, so here is some example code. We can see here we're in a test class. I've created a test method called test square. And down here you can see this method, and we notice that it doesn't have the test method tag. So we're going to have to call this method from somewhere else, which we're doing here in test square. So creating an instance of the object, right, that's our class, calling test square, passing it a value, getting the result, and making an assertion. Now our square method, what we're doing down here, is accepting that value, doing a calculation, and returning that result. So if we want to see this in action, now we know we can run the test and that it'll run this code. We know that we can debug the test, and ultimately that's the best way to look at this process, especially if we are having some kind of problem and we need to be able to track it down. So we put our breakpoint in, and then we want to be able to debug the test. So I set the breakpoint, I debug the test. Here we are stopped at our point of execution, and we can see down here at the bottom of the Visual Studio window where we have all of these tabs that we have one called the call stack. And so we can see that this is where we're stopped, and as we step into that method, there it is added to the top of that stack. And as we walk through the method, this is how Visual Studio knows where to return you. It knows to return you to this line, line 13, in this file. And so as our code gets more complex and we might have a method that calls a method that calls another method, then we start to see this complexity in the call stack. And if we're trying to trace down a bug, knowing how the call stack works is incredibly important so that we can understand what we're seeing here And if our program should crash during execution, then we would be able to evaluate that call stack and determine maybe where that exception took place. So in this section of the course, we're going to talk all about different types of methods that are available to us and some of the techniques of object-oriented programming that we can use with methods.